Imagine waking up this morning. You pour your coffee, you grab your phone to check the news, and you see that 20% of the entire world's energy supply has just vanished.
Just completely gone.
Right, wiped off the map overnight. And it hasn't been, slowly drawn down over a decade. It hasn't been replaced by some sudden miracle of green energy.
Yeah, no magic solar panels saving the day here.
Exactly. So what does that actually do to your life? And I'm not just talking about the price on the side of your local gas station, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what does it do to the cost of groceries hitting the shelves?
To the security of your savings account?
Yeah, to the fundamental stability of the whole global economy.
It's the kind of scenario that literally keeps defense secretaries and central bank governors awake at night in a cold sweat.
I bet.
Because a shock of that magnitude, it doesn't just touch one sector. It infects the very bloodstream of modern existence. I mean, everything that moves, everything that is manufactured, it all relies on that baseline flow of energy.
And the terrifying reality of today's date, April 20th, 2026, is that, well, we're no longer dealing in hypotheticals.
No, we really aren't.
We don't have to imagine it anymore. The world is watching the Persian Gulf right now, basically holding its collective breath.
Yep.
Because we are standing right on the edge of that exact precipice.
We really are.
So today we've got an incredibly dense and frankly alarming stack of sources to guide us through this deep dive.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. We're working from this extensive synthesis by the geopolitical blog Brockface. And they're breaking down a brand new super urgent piece by the Nobel laureate Paul Krugman.
Right, a Substack article called The Harm from Hormuz.
Yeah, that's the one. And our mission today is to map out exactly how the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is creating this massive economic shockwave.
And also trace the frankly complex and totally failed diplomatic negotiations that drag the world into this deadlock.
Exactly. We want to see if a face-saving off-ramp even exists at this point.
Yeah.
But before we tear into the mechanics of how this crisis actually functions, I do need to address the framing of our source material.
Yeah, that's a really important disclaimer to make up front.
Right, because Paul Krugman, well, he pulls no punches here. He explicitly characterizes this entire situation as, quote, Trump's Iran debacle.
He's very direct about his stance.
Very. And whether you violently agree with that partisan framing or you completely reject it, and I want to be super clear, as your guides today, we are absolutely not here to play political referee.
No, not at all.
We are not taking sides. Because the math that Krugman presents, it really doesn't care who you voted for.
No, market forces do not care about your political affiliations.
Exactly. So our goal is strictly to look at the raw economic arguments and the historical timeline that the source lays out. We're just trying to pull back the curtain on the mechanics of this standoff, completely impartially, so you can understand the sheer gravity of what is happening to the global economy.
That's really the only way to approach something of this magnitude. I mean, the political blame game is just noise right now. The signal is the data.
The data, the negotiations, the naval movements.
Right, the terrifying market realities. We really have to understand the cause and effect here.
So let's start with the math then. Because before we can even talk about, naval blockades or these crazy diplomatic marathons, we really have to grasp the sheer scale of the economic anvil hanging over our heads right now.
Yeah, we have to talk about the Strait of Hormuz itself.
Right.
For anyone who hasn't, stared at a nautical map recently, the Strait of Hormuz is this remarkably narrow waterway. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and from there out to the open ocean.
It's tiny, right?
Yeah. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only a couple of miles wide. Yet, under normal conditions, roughly 20% of the global oil supply is squeezed through that specific tiny geographic choke point.
20%. 1 in 5 barrels of oil that power human civilization goes through there.
It's staggering when you think about it.
It really is. And right now, as we sit here on April 20th, the gate is locked. It is completely closed. And our source, Krugman's analysis, suggests it could easily stay that way for months.
And this is where Krugman rings the absolute loudest alarm bell in his piece. He argues that if this closure drags on for even another 3 months, which, based on the diplomatic deadlock we're going to discuss later, is actually a highly probable scenario.
Which is terrifying.
It is. He says a full-on global recession transitions from being just a risk to being a baseline expectation.
So it becomes more likely than not.
Exactly. More likely than not.
The numbers in the source put a really chilling perspective on this. Because before February 28th, before the war essentially froze the strait, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF,
Yeah.
they had forecast global economic growth at a baseline of 3% for the year.
Right, and 3% it's the hum of a healthy engine.
Yeah.
It means economies are expanding, people are getting jobs, global trade is flowing smoothly. But Krugman makes the case that a prolonged Hormuz closure could take that 3% and just completely obliterate it.
Wow. Obliterated down to what?
We are talking about global growth plummeting to zero, or even plunging into negative territory for the next 2 years.
Negative growth for 2 years.
Yeah. That isn't just a temporary dip in the stock market. That is the actual wealth of nations evaporating.
And the transmission mechanism for that evaporation is basically the price of oil, right? The source notes that estimates are wildly all over the map right now, which just speaks to the absolute panic in the market.
Oh, totally.
Like you have projections ranging from a really painful $99 a barrel all the way up to a staggering, almost incomprehensible $372 a barrel.
And what's fascinating here is how Krugman explains that massive variance. The difference in those estimates really comes down to how different analysts are modeling this one specific concept that he focuses on heavily.
Which is what?
Demand destruction.
Demand destruction. I mean, it's such a clinical economist term for something that sounds incredibly violent.
Well, the violence is real. It's just distributed economically. The logic is totally inescapable. I mean, the world simply cannot conjure 20% of its daily oil supply out of thin air.
Right. There's no magic wand.
There is no secret subterranean reserve. There's no dormant mega pipeline that can just instantly switch on and replace the millions of barrels that are currently trapped behind the Strait of Hormuz.
So if the supply just vanishes, the physical laws of the universe basically dictate that the world must burn less oil.
Exactly. The oil isn't there, so you literally can't use it.
So how does the world actually ensure that we use less oil? Because people don't just volunteer to stop driving.
Right, you don't ask nicely. The market forces it through price. The price skyrockets to a point where regular people and huge industries simply cannot afford to operate anymore.
So they just consume less by default.
Exactly. Factories shutter their doors. Massive shipping fleets just sit idle at port because they can't afford the fuel. This involuntary, brutal reduction in human and economic activity, that is what demand destruction is.
Wow.
And that forced contraction, that is the anatomical definition of a global slump.
The source notes that Krugman actually reaches back 50 years for a parallel to this. He points to the 1973 Yom Kippur War and the subsequent Arab oil embargo as the closest historical rhyme to what we are facing right now.
Yeah, it's the textbook example for economists. In 1973, you had this massive geopolitically driven constraint on supply, and the result was just overnight panic.
Right, the famous images of long lines at gas stations.
Exactly. Lines around the block, galloping inflation, and a really severe economic recession that honestly fundamentally altered global politics.
Okay, let's unpack this because I really need to challenge this parallel.
Yeah.
The source itself addresses a pretty massive caveat here. It's 2026. You're not living in 1973. Our economy's oil intensity, which is, the amount of oil required to generate a single dollar of GDP, that is drastically lower today than it was back then.
Oh, absolutely.
We have millions of electric vehicles on the road now. We have massively improved fuel efficiency standards. We have a digital service-based economy where a huge chunk of the workforce can just operate from a laptop on a Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah, the Zoom economy.
Exactly. So if we are demonstrably less chained to crude oil than we were 50 years ago, why is a massive recession still the primary default mechanism for destroying this demand? Why can't the modern economy just, absorb the shock, reroute things, and keep humming along?
It's an incredibly intuitive pushback, and honestly, it's the exact question policymakers are desperately asking themselves in Washington right now.
I'm sure they are.
It is entirely true that our overall oil intensity is lower.
Yeah.
The problem, though, is that the demand that does remain is uniquely rigid. It is incredibly inflexible.
Inflexible meaning it's just structurally baked into our daily lives. We can't get away from it.
Yes, exactly. And the text highlights two massive areas where this is true. Suburban driving, particularly in North America, and trucking in emerging markets.
Okay, let's break that down.
Let's look at trucking first. You cannot invent, manufacture, and deploy a hyper-efficient, non-fossil fuel logistics fleet for the entire developing world by next Tuesday.
Yeah, obviously not.
If an agricultural hub in an emerging market relies completely on diesel trucks to move fertilizer to their farms and then move the crops to the ports, they can't just magically switch to electric semi-trucks when the price of diesel triples overnight.
So the trucks just stop running. The
Exactly.
fertilizer doesn't arrive, the crop yield drops, food prices spike globally, and you have a cascading crisis.
Precisely. It cascades. And then look at the developed world. Millions and millions of people live in suburban sprawls that were built explicitly around the internal combustion engine.
Right.
They have absolutely no mass transit alternative to get to their jobs or to get groceries.
I mean, it's kind of like trying to instantly slash your household budget by 20%.
Yeah.
But your fixed costs are completely untouchable.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, let's say you get hit with a pay cut.
Yeah.
You can't just snap your fingers, break your lease without a penalty, and instantly teleport your family into a cheaper apartment that's closer to your office. You are essentially trapped by the physical geography of your life.
You're locked in.
Yeah. You still have to pay the rent. You still have to commute. So to absorb that sudden financial shock, you have to cut into the bone somewhere else. You stop buying goods. You stop going to restaurants. You basically just stay home.
And when millions of people simultaneously stay home and stop spending their money, the businesses they used to patronize just collapse.
Right.
The demand is destroyed, yes, but only by taking the broader economy down with it.
So that analogy perfectly captures the macro scale of what Krugman is talking about. For you, listening right now, the pain at the pump isn't just an isolated tax on your weekend plans. A $200 fill-up isn't just frustrating, it is the leading edge of a global contraction.
It really is. It is the invisible hand of the market physically forcing businesses to stop shipping materials. It's forcing factories to throttle their production and forcing consumers to bunker down simply because motion itself has become unaffordable.
And when motion stops, the economy dies.
Exactly.
That terrifying stillness is exactly what we were staring down today. So the obvious question is, how the hell did we march ourselves to the edge of this cliff?
Yeah, how did we get here?
Right. That requires us to look backwards. To understand the total deadlock of April 2026, we have to look at the ghosts of 2025. We have to examine the diplomatic illusion that preceded this current war.
Because the war that broke out on February 28th, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was the explosive finale to a full year of back-channel maneuvers and diplomatic mirages that constantly promised breakthroughs but consistently delivered failure.
According to the timeline mapped out in our source, the foundation for this crisis was actually laid over a year ago, back in March and April of 2025.
Right, spring of 2025.
And this all kicked off with indirect negotiations taking place in cities like Muscat, in Oman, and over in Rome. And the catalyst for this was a letter sent from the Trump administration directly to Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei.
And to understand why those talks failed, we really have to look at the starting positions of both sides.
Okay.
The U.S. entered those 2025 negotiations with what diplomats refer to as a maximalist posture. The text is very specific about the demands here. The U.S. required the full physical dismantlement of Iran's enrichment capabilities.
Full dismantlement.
They demanded zero enrichment permitted on Iranian soil forever.
Wow.
And kind of as a cherry on top, they demanded the disarmament of Iranian proxy groups scattered across the Middle East. All of this in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions.
Let's isolate that phrase for a second, zero enrichment, because we aren't just talking about putting a ceiling on how pure they can refine uranium.
Yeah.
The U.S. is demanding the absolute erasure of the capability entirely.
Yeah.
They're saying, take highly advanced, multi-billion-dollar, heavily fortified facilities like Natanz and Fordo. These are places buried deep inside mountains, and dismantle them.
Basically eradicate the infrastructure entirely.
Right.
Now pivot to what Iran was actually offering in those rooms in Oman and Rome. The text shows Iran countering with pragmatic but fiercely temporary concessions.
Temporary being the keyword.
Exactly. They offered to cap enrichment at 3.67%, which, for context, is the level required for civilian nuclear energy. It's far below weapons grade.
Okay, so a cap.
Right. They also offered to dilute their existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium, or perhaps transfer it to a third-party country for safeguarding. They agreed to enhanced inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA.
So they were giving some ground.
They even signaled a willingness to rein in some of their proxy activities.
So what does this all mean? This is just a fundamental misalignment of reality. The U.S. is sitting across the table basically saying, burn your house down, salt the earth, and hand over the deed. And Iran is countering with, well, we will lock the front door, give the keys to a security guard for a few years, and let you look through the windows whenever you want.
That's a perfect analogy.
And yet, the source notes that throughout 2025, there were reports of significant progress in these talks.
Yeah.
How do you possibly get progress out of that kind of chasm?
Well, the progress was really a mirage born out of desperation. Negotiators were likely finding tactical middle ground on the absolute margins. Maybe agreeing in principle on how the dilution of uranium might work or how the IAEA inspections could be structured.
The logistics of it.
But they were willfully ignoring the structural rot at the core of the talks. The U.S. wanted irreversible destruction. Iran was only ever going to offer reversible pauses.
And the reason Iran will only offer a reversible pause brings us to really the psychological anchor of this entire conflict.
Yes, the psychology is huge here.
Why would any sovereign nation agree to irreversibly destroy its most prized, heavily defended technological infrastructure?
Sure.
I mean, they wouldn't, especially not with the historical baggage in this specific relationship.
Exactly. And this is where we have to factor in the trauma of 2018. The U.S. unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA, which was the original Iran nuclear deal, that fundamentally rewired Tehran's negotiating psychology.
Let's talk about that for a second, because in 2015, they had a deal.
They did.
Iran agreed to severe limitations on their program. The U.S. agreed to lift sanctions. Everyone signed it. And then 3 years later, the U.S. simply walks away and reimposes the crushing economic pressure.
So put yourself in the shoes of Iran's supreme leader or the commanders of the Revolutionary Guard.
Okay.
You were sitting at a table in 2025. The nation sitting across from you is demanding that you basically pour concrete into your centrifuges and permanently surrender your nuclear leverage.
Yeah.
If you actually do that, what happens when the political winds shift in Washington 3 years later? What happens if a new administration comes in and just voids the deal again?
Well, if you've already smashed all your centrifuges, you have literally nothing left to negotiate with. You are totally defenseless.
Precisely. You have surrendered your ultimate deterrent for a promise that history has already proven can be broken. This is the geopolitical equivalent of fool me once.
Yeah, fool me once, shame on you.
And this deep mutual mistrust meant that Iran was never, under any circumstances, going to agree to permanent dismantlement. They absolutely needed an insurance policy.
Right, because a cap to 3.67% can always be lifted. Diluted uranium can be re-enriched later.
Exactly. But the U.S. knew this too, which is exactly why they demanded dismantlement in the first place. They wanted a deal that Iran couldn't easily back out of.
So they are basically trapped in a room where neither side can give the other what they fundamentally require.
It's a total impasse.
And the tragedy of the 2025 timeline is that even the fragile temporary bridges they managed to build were repeatedly blown up.
Quite literally, in some cases.
Yeah, the source is explicitly clear that the talks continually collapsed due to kinetic military action. It highlights Israeli strikes in June of 2025, and then the massive escalation on February 28, 2026.
It creates this really catastrophic cycle. Diplomacy inches forward based on tiny, reversible concessions. Then, the military reality on the ground suddenly shifts, a strike here, a retaliation there.
And it all falls apart.
The political capital required to compromise just evaporates instantly. The mistrust deepens, and the negotiators are sent right back to square one, but with an even higher threshold of anger and grievance to overcome.
And that exact cycle of fragile talks and sudden violence is the rhythm that birthed the full-scale war on February 28th.
Yes.
But all of that indirect posturing in Oman and Rome was ultimately just a prelude. Because once the war actually started, the back channels just weren't enough anymore. They needed a massive circuit breaker.
They needed to stop the bleeding.
Which brings us to arguably the most agonizing part of this timeline, the Islamabad breakdown.
Yeah, the Islamabad talks. Even in the midst of a terrifying regional war, there was this momentary gasp of sanity. In early April 2026, massive international pressure forced a delicate 2-week ceasefire.
The mechanics of how that ceasefire came together are actually super fascinating. The text notes it was brokered by Pakistan on April 7th and 8th.
Right.
But the crucial detail is that China was quietly nudging Khamenei's successor to accept it. It really shows you how terrified the broader international community, even nations that traditionally oppose U.S. hegemony, are of this conflict spiraling totally out of control. Nobody wants a closed strait.
Oh, absolutely. The gravity of a potential $370 barrel of oil creates very, very strange bedfellows.
I bet.
That ceasefire paved the way for something that hadn't actually happened yet in this crisis. Direct face-to-face negotiations.
No intermediaries this time.
None.
Yeah.
Just the primary antagonists locked in a room together in Islamabad, Pakistan on April 11th and 12th.
The source describes it as a grueling 21-hour marathon session. Just pause and think about the sheer human toll of that.
It sounds exhausting.
You have the most powerful diplomats on Earth, locked in a room for a full day and night, sleep-deprived, fueled by adrenaline and historical grievances, basically holding the fate of the global economy in their hands.
And the players involved were absolute heavy hitters.
Yeah. Who was in the room?
The U.S. sent Vice President J.D. Vance, Stephen Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, and Iran sent senior figures Abbas Araqi and Mohammad Bagher Kalibaf.
You put that level of authority in a room for 21 hours. You expect a breakthrough, right? Or at least some kind of framework for a breakthrough.
You would hope so. Instead, the talks failed spectacularly. The text bluntly states they collapsed with, quote, gaps on major issues and absolutely no trust.
So to understand why it failed so totally, we have to look at the term sheets they were sliding across the table at, like hour 20.
Let's lay them out, because the gap isn't just wide, it's almost like they're existing in two completely different dimensions.
Right.
The U.S. demands in Islamabad were essentially a formalized version of their maximalist pre-war stance. They demanded a 20-year total suspension of all nuclear enrichment.
20 years.
They demanded the physical dismantlement of the nuclear facilities. And critically, they demanded the full handover of Iran's entire enriched uranium stockpile.
We are talking about hundreds of kilos of highly enriched material here. This is material that Iran spent billions of dollars and suffered years of crippling economic sanctions just to produce.
It is their crowning technological achievement. It's their ultimate leverage.
So the U.S. essentially says, stop for a generation, tear down the buildings, and give us everything you've built.
Yep.
After 21 hours of that, what was Iran's counteroffer?
Well, Iran offered a 3 to 5 year suspension of enrichment.
That's a huge difference.
Massive. And they absolutely insisted on the retention of their right to peaceful enrichment on their own soil. They flatly refused the physical dismantlement of any facilities, and they refused the complete handover of the stockpile.
So it's 20 years versus 3 to 5 years. Complete erasure versus a temporary pause. Surrender the material versus keep it under lock and key.
Total mismatch.
And we haven't even touched on the second major impasse of the negotiation.
Huh.
The Strait of Hormuz itself.
Right, the very waterway causing the global panic in the first place. It was treated as a completely separate negotiating track, and it was just as deadlocked.
Unbelievable.
During the Islamabad marathon, Iran demanded a formal regulatory role over the strait. They wanted the international community to legally recognize their right to manage or at least monitor commercial passage through those waters.
In the U.S.
The U.S., unsurprisingly, demanded unrestricted, completely open access to the strait for all global shipping, with zero Iranian interference whatsoever.
This raises an important question, though. I really want to zero in on something deeply fundamental here.
Sure.
Why did Iran view those U.S. demands regarding the nuclear program? You know, the 20-year ban, the dismantlement, not just as bad negotiating terms, but as outright surrender terms.
That's the exact phrase they use.
Right. Why is this such an impossible pill for them to swallow?
To answer that, we really have to peel back the layers of Iranian state ideology. The source explicitly notes that Iran views peaceful nuclear enrichment on its own soil as an inalienable right.
An inalienable right.
Yes. This is not just diplomatic posturing for them. It is a core pillar of their national identity at this point. It is deeply tied to their sense of scientific advancement, their national pride, and really their fundamental resistance to Western imperialism.
But calling it an inalienable right feels like a massive diplomatic trap that they've set for themselves.
How so?
Well, if they define this capability as a fundamental, non-negotiable pillar of their sovereignty, they have literally backed their own leadership into a corner. If they compromise on an inalienable right, it looks like treason to their own hardliners back home.
Yeah.
How do you negotiate a compromise with an absolute?
The short answer is you often can't, and that's the underlying tragedy of the Islamabad talks. For the Iranian leadership, accepting the U.S. terms, destroying the facilities they have spent decades defending from sabotage and airstrikes, and handing over all the material would be political suicide.
It would be humiliating.
It would be a humiliating, televised defeat. And remember, they had already survived the initial military strikes of February 28.
Right, the war was already happening.
Exactly. In their calculus, they had weathered the kinetic storm, and they still held the ultimate trump card, the closed strait. They felt they had enough leverage to look the U.S. vice president in the eye and just say no.
Let's try to visualize this standoff because it reminds me of a severely hostile corporate buyout.
Oh, okay. I like where this is going.
Imagine a massive, ruthless conglomerate is trying to forcibly acquire a defiant tech startup.
Right.
The buyer, the conglomerate, demands that the founder of the startup not only step down from the company for 20 years, but also demands that the founder take all their proprietary blueprints into the parking lot and set them on fire, and then hand over the only physical prototypes they've ever built. It's the total erasure of their life's work.
Yes, and to take your analogy just a step further into reality.
Okay.
Imagine the conglomerate is also currently parked outside the startup's warehouse with a fleet of bulldozers threatening to flatten the building if the founder doesn't sign the paperwork immediately.
Because that is the implicit threat of the U.S. military.
Exactly.
Exactly. And the founder, sitting at the table, sweating, says, look, I will step back from day-to-day operations for 3 years, maybe 5. But I keep the patents, the blueprints stay in my safe, and the prototypes stay in our warehouse.
There is just no middle ground to be found there.
None. The conglomerate wants total ownership and historical erasure. The founder is only offering a temporary leave of absence while guarding the underlying value of their life. The gap is just structurally unbridgeable.
And because that gap could not be bridged in 21 hours, the Islamabad talks entirely collapsed.
Total failure.
The diplomats packed their briefcases, that brief window of hope slammed shut, and the conflict violently shifted away from the negotiating table in Pakistan right back to the churning waters of the Persian Gulf.
Which takes us right into the chaos of the 72-hour ping pong and the total weaponization of the strait. Because what happens on the water immediately after the Islamabad failure is genuinely mind-bending.
Yeah, the timeline gets incredibly chaotic here. But we need to establish the baseline status of the strait since the war officially kicked off on February 28th.
Okay, what was happening before this ping pong?
According to the timeline, Iran's immediate move in late February was to restrict or close the strait to nearly all commercial traffic. The text cites a greater than 90% drop in vessels passing through.
Just pause and conceptualize that for a second. 90% of the traffic in one of the most vital arteries of global commerce just evaporates.
It's a ghost town.
But I really want to understand the mechanics of this. It's not a toll booth. How do you actually close a 21-mile-wide body of water to massive container ships and supertankers?
Well, it's a combination of physical threat and economic reality. Iran doesn't have to build a physical wall across the water. They just changed the rules of passage.
Oh, so.
Suddenly, any ship attempting to transit required an Iranian permit, the payment of exorbitant fees, or what Tehran dubbed safe conduct passes.
And if a ship captain decides to ignore the paperwork and just, sail through anyway.
Then they meet the physical enforcement mechanism.
Which is?
Armed, fast-attack gunboats, harassing vessels, firing warning shots across the bow, and most terrifyingly, the deployment of naval mines into the shipping lanes.
Oh, mines.
Yeah, and the mere threat of a naval mine is often enough to close a strait. You don't even need a ship to hit one.
Because of the insurance.
Exactly. The moment a mine is reported in the water, the maritime insurance markets in places like Lloyd's of London instantly freeze. The premiums to insure a $100 million supertanker and its cargo skyrocket to levels that wipe out any potential profit from the voyage.
So it's not even worth the trip.
Right. The shipping companies themselves order their captains to drop anchor and wait. The physical blockade triggers an invisible economic blockade.
So for 6 weeks, this chokehold is just strangling the globe. But then right after the Islamabad talks fall apart, we get this bizarre whiplash sequence of events.
The ping pong.
Right. On April 17th, Iran suddenly announces a full reopening of the strait for commercial ships, just out of nowhere.
Yep.
The text notes this actually provided a temporary massive boost to global markets. People looking at their screens thought, wait, is a secret deal happening? Did sanity actually prevail?
Well, the market exhaled for exactly 24 hours.
Because the very next day.
Because the very next day, April 18th, Iran violently reversed course. They completely reimposed the full closure. They resumed firing warning shots across the bows of commercial vessels and declared that absolutely no ship could move without explicit permission from the Revolutionary Guard.
It makes no sense on the surface. Why throw the doors open on the 17th and slam them shut on the 18th? Was it like a miscommunication between their diplomats and their admirals?
No, it wasn't an accident. The timeline provides the exact trigger for the reversal. On April 18th, the Trump administration announced an immediate, comprehensive U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports and any shipping linked to the strait.
A full, physical U.S. naval blockade.
Yes. They deployed American sea power to choke off Iran's own lifelines. And the escalation didn't stop with just a press release.
What happened?
The very next day, April 19th, U.S. naval forces physically intercepted and seized an Iranian-flagged cargo ship named the Tuska right near the approaches to the strait.
Wow.
Yeah. Iran instantly labeled the seizure maritime piracy and vowed severe retaliation.
So let's untangle the psychology of that 72-hour window.
Yeah.
If Iran opened the strait on the 17th, it wasn't a gesture of goodwill at all. It was a demonstration.
Exactly. It's what political scientists call operating within a mutually hurting stalemate.
Okay, unpack that.
By opening the strait on the 17th, Iran was sending a very clear, very dangerous signal to Washington and the global markets. They were saying, look at this power. We can let the oil flow. We can ease your inflation. We can save your political careers, but we are the ones holding the key. We control this valve.
It was a massive flex of asymmetric leverage.
Exactly.
But Washington sees that flex and basically decides to call bluff with a sledgehammer.
The U.S. responds by saying, we don't recognize your control of the valve. In fact, we are bringing our own valve.
Wow.
By announcing the naval blockade on the 18th, the U.S. is attempting to impose physical, suffocating pressure on Iran's own economy. They are trying to squeeze Tehran until they capitulate on the nuclear demands.
So Iran instantly snaps the strait shut again in response.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
What we are witnessing is the absolute terrifying weaponization of geography.
That's exactly what it is.
Iran is using its geographic proximity to the world's oil supply as a weapon of mass economic disruption, hoping to inflict enough pain on the global economy that the U.S. is forced to back down.
And simultaneously, the U.S. is using its overwhelming blue water naval superiority to physically isolate Iran, hoping to starve the regime into submission.
And caught in the middle of this clash of titans is literally the entire global supply chain.
It's a nightmare.
Think about the sheer nightmare of trying to operate a global business in this environment. Put yourself in the shoes of a shipping magnate in Singapore or, an energy minister trying to keep the power grid online in a major Asian metropolis.
How do you even plan for next week?
You don't. How on earth do you plan your logistics when the fundamental rules of international waters are changing every 24 hours based on gunboat skirmishes and retaliatory press releases? You just can't.
The uncertainty is totally paralyzing.
You cannot dispatch a fleet of oil tankers hoping the passage is safe on Tuesday, knowing it might be actively mined by Wednesday. The uncertainty itself acts as a massive tax.
It does. That uncertainty creates an immense risk premium that gets violently priced into everything. It's not just the oil that isn't flowing, it's the cost of the oil that is flowing through alternative, much longer routes.
Right.
It gets priced into the fuel for container ships, the plastic and consumer goods, the fertilizer for agriculture. Everything gets more expensive.
Which brings us right to the bleeding edge of the present moment, April 20th.
Here we are.
The delicate 2-week ceasefire is effectively dead. The strait is locked down tighter than ever. The U.S. blockade is active and they're seizing ships. The direct talks in Islamabad are just a smoke and ruin.
The tension is at an absolute maximum.
It is. If we stay on this trajectory, Krugman's math becomes reality. We hit the $370 barrel of oil, demand is violently destroyed, and the global economy enters a deep freeze. So, we desperately have to ask the final question. How do we find a face-saving off-ramp?
Well, to find a realistic off-ramp, we have to aggressively discard the illusions that both sides are currently clinging to.
Illusions like what?
The source text is brutally clear in its assessment of the U.S.'s maximalist strategy. It assesses the chances of Iran simply buckling under the blockade, agreeing to end its nuclear program entirely, and handing over all its enriched uranium as low. In fact, it goes further, calling that outcome near zero in any realistic near-term deal.
So the prevailing theory in Washington, that if you just squeeze the economic python tight enough, Iran will eventually hand over the keys to the nuclear kingdom. The source is essentially calling that a total delusion.
It's simply not going to happen.
Why are they so sure?
Because it ignores the fundamental reality of the adversary. The deep historical mistrust stemming from 2018, the ideological perception of the nuclear program as a sacred, inalienable right, and the brutal fact that Iran still holds the ultimate hostage, the global economy, via the strait.
Right.
All of that means total unconditional capitulation is completely off the table.
Okay, so if total U.S. victory is impossible, and total Iranian victory is obviously unacceptable, what does the messy alternative actually look like? How do you end a massive conflict when neither side can achieve their primary objective?
We have to look at the incredibly cynical but historically accurate path forward that Paul Krugman suggests in his piece.
What does he suggest?
He argues that the only way out is for the U.S. to loudly proclaim victory while quietly accepting de facto defeat.
Loudly proclaim victory, quietly accept defeat. I mean, how does a global superpower actually swallow that? How do you sell that to your domestic political base without getting crucified?
You rely on the complexity of the deal to obscure the actual concessions.
Give me an example.
We've seen this before in history. Think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. loudly proclaimed absolute victory when the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba.
Right, Kennedy was the hero.
Exactly. But quietly, months later, the U.S. accepted a de facto compromise by removing its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The public victory completely masked the private concession.
Oh, wow. So what does the Jupiter missile compromise look like for Hormuz in 2026?
Well, the source actually outlines the contours of what a plausible, face-saving deal would entail. And you're right, it is a remarkably messy middle ground.
Let's hear it.
It essentially splits the difference between the Islamabad demands. Instead of a 20-year ban or a 3-year pause, they settle on a 5 to 10-year enrichment pause.
A 5 to 10-year freeze. I guess that kicks the can just far enough down the road for current politicians to claim they secured a generation of peace, while Iran knows they can literally just wait out the clock.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But what about the massive stockpile of highly enriched uranium? The U.S. demanded it be handed over completely, remember?
Yeah, what happens to that?
The compromise outlined here is fascinating. Instead of a humiliating handover to Washington, the stockpile could be relocated to a neutral, or at least mutually acceptable, third party.
Like who?
The text specifically suggests Russia as a possible destination for an escrow arrangement.
Wait, Russia?
Yeah. Iran doesn't lose the material permanently, but it is physically removed from their immediate jurisdiction. And that satisfies the U.S. security requirement that Iran can't just sprint to build a weapon.
Okay, what about verification? How do we know they aren't still enriching?
Enhanced, highly intrusive access for the IAEA to verify that the centrifuges are actually spinning down.
But here's the critical part, the actual price of the deal, right?
Yes.
In exchange for the pause, the Russian escrow, and the inspectors, there would need to be ironclad international guarantees that the Strait of Hormuz remains open.
Absolutely.
And the most bitter pill for Washington, the U.S. would have to quietly but definitively abandon the demand for zero enrichment forever.
They have to concede the inalienable right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, let's look at the scoreboard of this messy compromise. Iran gets to keep the physical infrastructure of its nuclear facilities totally intact.
Yep.
It gets a subtle, tacit international recognition of its right to peaceful nuclear energy down the line, and it gets the crushing sanctions and the naval blockade lifted.
And what does the U.S. get?
The U.S. gets the Strait of Hormuz reopened immediately, avoiding an economic apocalypse. They get a verifiable 10-year freeze on the nuclear program, and the dangerous material is shipped out of the region entirely.
Both sides get to stand in front of their respective flags, declare absolute victory, and pretend they didn't just spend a year bombing each other just to arrive back at a slightly modified version of the exact deal they tore up in 2018.
It's absurd when you put it like that.
It is.
But why would both sides eventually swallow their immense pride and accept a deal that falls so spectacularly short of their initial goals? What forces them to finally sign the messy compromise?
The answer is gravity, the sheer crushing gravity of economic self-interest.
Because pride and ideology are powerful motivators, but they don't buy wheat and they don't fuel power grids.
Exactly. Ideology cannot shield a nation from the physics of a collapsing economy forever.
Yeah.
The risk of a full-scale, synchronized global recession is basically a weapon of mass political destruction. We are talking about severe fuel shortages paralyzing the Asian manufacturing powerhouses.
Which means empty shelves for us.
We are talking about hyperinflation tearing through the Western middle class. For the leadership in Washington, presiding over a devastating, self-inflicted global recession destroys political capital instantly. It ends careers and reshapes elections.
And for Tehran?
For Iran, holding the strait closed indefinitely is a suicide pact. It severely damages their own heavily sanctioned economy, which still relies on clandestine global trade.
They need to sell oil, too.
Exactly. And more importantly, if they push the global community into a deep enough depression, they invite the very real possibility of an overwhelming existential military retaliation from a coalition of desperate nations who literally cannot afford to let them keep the strait closed.
So they're playing with fire.
The pain of the current stalemate is so acute, the economic bleeding is so severe, that it creates an inescapable incentive structure. Both sides are being pushed toward an imperfect diplomatic off-ramp because the alternative is mutually assured economic destruction.
You know, we all inherently crave clean, cinematic resolutions to these things. We want the movie ending. The adversary surrenders unconditionally, the heroes win, the treaty is signed on the gleaming deck of a battleship, and the world resets to normal.
But that's just not reality.
Strike. For everyone listening to this right now, the reality of global geopolitics is profoundly ugly. A messy, imperfect, deeply unsatisfying truce one where nobody is truly happy, where the core ideological issues are just band-aged over and kicked 5 years down the road. That is often the absolute best-case scenario.
It really is.
Because that ugly truce is the only thing that gets the oil tankers moving again. It is the only thing that stops runaway inflation from devouring your savings account. It is the mechanism that protects your everyday cost of living. Peace, in this specific context, isn't some grand moral victory. It is simply the mutually agreed cessation of economic suicide.
It is the triumph of exhausted pragmatism over ideological purity. And right now, as the ceasefire expires and the rhetoric heats up, the entire world is literally holding its breath to see if pragmatism can somehow win out over pride in the halls of power in Washington and Tehran.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive into the abyss today. Let's briefly pull all of these threads together and look at the terrifying mosaic of April 20th, 2026.
Okay, let's summarize.
We were looking at a scenario where 20% of the lifeblood of the global economy is essentially being held hostage behind a 21-mile-wide gate. The entire planet is teetering on the edge of a massive, forced recession driven by the brutal mechanics of demand destruction.
A completely preventable recession, too.
We traced how a year of diplomatic illusions in Oman and Rome finally crashed into reality during a sleep-deprived 21-hour marathon in Islamabad, a negotiation that collapsed over fundamentally incompatible definitions of national sovereignty and nuclear rights.
The unbridgeable gap.
And now, we are watching competing military forces, an Iranian closure enforced by the invisible terror of naval mines, and a U.S. naval blockade actively seizing vessels, playing a high-stakes game of chicken in one of the most vital geographic arteries on the planet.
It is the ultimate modern crisis. You have state-of-the-art military hardware and incredibly complex diplomatic maneuvering, and it's all completely paralyzed by core ideological differences. It leaves mutual economic devastation as the only real lever left to force a resolution.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, incredibly provocative thought to chew on, something that really stuck with me from Krugman's piece.
What's that?
He mentions that, given enough time, if the world had a year or two of runway, we could orchestrate major macro shifts to other energy sources to bypass this specific choke point. We could adapt.
Sure, humans are adaptable.
But we don't have a year. The market needs that energy today. And when you think about that, think about the profound, almost humiliating fragility it exposes about our modern existence.
Oh, man. Yeah.
We live in the year 2026. We live in a highly advanced, digitized, AI-driven civilization. We are landing reusable rockets on drone ships in the ocean. We are mapping the human genome and building quantum computers.
We feel so advanced.
Right. Yet despite all of our towering technological supremacy, despite our digital arrogance, our entire global economy, the security of your livelihood, the stability of your local grocery store, your ability to simply drive to work, all of it can still be brought to its absolute knees by the physical closure of a single 21-mile-wide strip of water in the Middle East.
It's incredibly humbling.
Are we really as modern, as resilient, and as decoupled from the physical world as we like to think we are? Or, just beneath the gleaming digital surface of our lives, are we still entirely at the mercy of raw, inescapable physical geography? Think about that vulnerability the next time you swipe your card at the gas pump, and consider just how quickly the brutal reality of demand destruction could alter the landscape of your own daily life.